Well, it is 80 degrees outside and it's March, so that can only mean it's springtime here in Tennessee. And it also means it's time to double up on that allergy medicine, get out there and start tackling some outdoor projects. Now, I've had a lot of fun turning our backyard into a more beautiful and functional place to hang out. So, to get you motivated and inspired to do the same in your space, here are 5 outdoor DIY projects, all put into one video to get you started.
Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to show you how to build these simple, clean, and modern planter boxes. This is a quick and easy weekend project that requires minimal materials and tools. I've got 2 different sizes and I'm going to have plans for those down in the description below, so let's do it.
As I mentioned, these planter boxes can be made with minimal materials. The boxes themselves will be made entirely from these cedar 1x4s. Don't worry, you're not going to need nearly this much material. I'm making a total of 4 planters, so I bought enough to cover my needs. So to start, I need to break down these boards to length using my miter saw. You can certainly do this work with a circular saw and a speed square, or heck, even with a hand saw, because this cedar is pretty easy to work with, but my miter saw has this nice stop block feature, so cutting multiple boards to the exact same length is super quick and easy. These boards are already surfaced on 3 sides, which means no milling, and it also means that they have a straight edge so you can get nice accurate cuts at the saw. And besides cedar's amazing color, it also has a great aroma. I really wish you guys could smell my shop right now. One thing you guys need to consider when you're cutting your parts is that cedar has natural variation in color. Sometimes it can be pretty dramatic. This is definitely not a bad thing, but you're going to need to think carefully about how you want to arrange your parts in your finished boxes to take advantage of that variation. Okay, with all my parts cut to length, I can move right along to assembling the sides of the box. The construction here is pretty simple. Each side consists of 4 boards. Just arrange them in the order that you think looks best and make sure that they're all facing the same direction. These cedar planks often have a milled side and a rough side. In my experience, the rough side is meant to be the show side as it has the best look. It will mean that you'll have to do a little more sanding if you want a smooth finish on the outside, or you can just leave it rough for a more rustic look. To hold the boards together, I made these 1.5" strips by cutting them down at the table saw. If you don't have access to a table saw, this can be done with a jigsaw or even a handsaw. Or you could just use full 1x4 strips here if you want. You're just going to need to buy a little extra material. So to position these strips, I just use 1 board as a spacer and then mark a line and fasten the strips to each side using screws. I'm pre-drilling these holes to avoid having the wood split on these narrow parts before I screw them into place. It's critical that I line up these strips with that line that I drew, and that's going to make sure that when I assemble the box, it's going to nest together tightly. One other detail that I added to the sides is this little chamfer to the outside edge of the boards, and I just used a trim router with a chamfer bit to do it. When the sides are assembled, it's going to give the appearance of a gap between each board, even though there won't be. This is a 100% optional step here. I just wanted to make sure that I gave these planters a little bit of visual interest. Another thing I found useful was to hold the boards in place with a clamp while they're being assembled, and this just makes the process much easier when the boards can't shift around. I also found it helped speed up the process, which is nice because I've got 16 of these sides to assemble. The long sides of the planters go together exactly the same way, but they get an extra strip in the middle, which is going to help support them and keep them from bowing out when these planters are filled up. I just marked a reference line in the center of the top and bottom of the sides, and then also in the center of the strip itself. That way I could just line up my marks and screw it home. And I thought once I got going on a few of these, this process turned out to be pretty easy. So with all my sides put together, I can go ahead and begin assembling the box. You can see here how easy these sides nest together in the corners. So it was at this point that I noticed there must have been some slight variation in the widths of the different boards, because when I went to assemble these, I noticed that some sides were slightly taller than others. This isn't a big deal as long as you assemble the box with the top facing down. That way any variation is going to be on the bottom of the box, which is ultimately just going to be hidden by the legs. To fasten the sides together, I'm using screws, and there's a couple of things to be careful of when you do this. I'm making sure to pre-drill these holes before I drive in the screws. Cedar is a soft wood and it could split pretty easily, especially screwing this close to the edge of the board. And when I'm placing these screws, I'm making sure that I'm drilling into the support strips and not into the end grain of the outer board, which is also going to help prevent splitting. Measuring in about 1 1/8 allowed me to hit that spot. Another thing that I did here was countersink these holes, otherwise the screw heads are going to interfere with the legs when they get added. I really like using these countersink bits from Amana because they can drill your pilot hole and countersink them all in one motion, which is just going to save you time. Now I have a box with 4 sides, but no bottom, so I'll take care of that next. I'm going to attach some support cleats along the bottom edge of each long side with screws. These cleats are going to be the same width as the support strips, just a little longer, and they're going to give the bottom slats a place to rest on. Then I can just start placing the slats one by one. For the slats, I added 2 countersunk holes on each end, and I'm leaving about 3/4 inch gap between each board to allow for drainage, while the gaps on the ends and the middle support are a little bit wider just to allow for those support strips. The slats just screw into the cleats nice and easy, and the long planter boxes have 10 slats, while the little square ones have 3 slats. By the way, now would be a great time to sand, and how much you sand is entirely up to your preference. You can really sand these all the way smooth or leave them completely rough. The only thing you should definitely sand is the top edge of the boxes, just to make sure that everything's flushed up for a finished look. So right now you could call these done and they're going to look pretty nice, but there is one additional thing that you can add here, and that's creating a nice mitered edge around the top. This just gives the planters a little more finished look while also protecting the top edge from weather. At a minimum, I would make these strips 1.5 inches, that way you cover the edge of the box as well as the support strips. But if you wanted to make them a little wider to create an overhang edge detail around the outside, I think that looks good too. I thought it was easy enough to pre-assemble these first, just using a little bit of glue and brad nails in the corners. Once those dried and were able to be moved, I attached them to the planters using glue and brad nails. Okay, so the main body of the planter is now done, and I'm going to go ahead and hit these with a little finish so that they can sit and dry while I focus on the legs.
To finish outdoor projects, there's a couple different ways you can go. The first is to try to create a bulletproof finish, which usually involves some type of epoxy or varnish. And these take forever to apply and even longer to cure. And you do all that work in vain only to have the finish fail after 2 or 3 years. See this bench as an example. And the other way is to just deal with the fact that all outdoor finishes eventually fail and focus on how easy it is to repair. With varnishes, you're going to have to sand the entire project all the way back down to bare wood and start over. But there is another way. For this project, I'm using an outdoor timber oil, which is really easy to apply. It just takes minutes, and you can brush it on, rag it on, or roll it on like I'm doing, and just wipe away the excess, and that's it. It doesn't create a film finish, so it's not going to offer as much protection, but it's just going to make it that much easier for you to go back on and wipe a new coat each year or two and move on.
So for the legs, I wanted a really modern look, and so I'm going with 2-inch angled steel. I can understand if you've never worked with steel before, this may be a little bit intimidating, but this really isn't too bad for a beginner to try. Really, the biggest obstacle here is that steel requires a special metal cutting saw, which I didn't own, but luckily a buddy of mine just down the street had one and let me borrow it to make these cuts. If that's not an option for you, you can also check your local big box store to see if you can rent one by the hour. Or if you buy this steel from a local steel supplier, there's a very good chance that they'll cut it to length for you when you make the purchase, and you can skip this step entirely. And there's also one final option, which is to skip the steel entirely and go with aluminum.
Besides being able to cut aluminum with your regular woodworking tools, you also don't have to worry about it rusting outside, unlike steel. It is going to be quite a bit more expensive than steel, and it's also not going to be as strong at the same thickness. So if I'm using 1/8 of an inch thick steel, I'd probably go with 3/16 or 1/4 inch aluminum.
So now that my legs are cut to length, I'm going to go ahead and drill holes in each leg so that I can fasten them to the planters. It's a good idea here to use a little lubricant and go slow. Okay, well, now I'm going to paint these legs with some black paint rated for outdoor use, which is just going to help protect the steel and also give the planters a super clean look. You also need to remember to clean off any of that lubricant from the steel first before you add the paint, because it's not going to stick otherwise. I use denatured alcohol to do this, but I think you could also use mineral spirits. And once the paint is dry, I can just screw them right to the planter box. The easiest way to do this is just to turn the planter box upside down, which is going to make alignment easy. And I also found these exterior screws that already have a black powder coating on them, which is going to match the legs and protect the screws from rusting. You'll also notice that I added an extra set of holes to the bottom of the legs, and that way if I ever decide to make these planter boxes taller, all I've got to do is cut an extra length of angle steel and bolt it to the bottom of the legs. I also found out that you can buy these little plastic boots that you can add to the end of the angle iron, which is just going to protect the bottom of the legs against the ground and water.
All right, guys, so when I was building this box, I made a big mistake that I knew about earlier, but I thought I was going to be able to hide it and not have to tell you about it. But it doesn't look like that's the case, so we're just going to have to throw it in the video. Come here, I'll show you. So when I was assembling this planter, I put the screws on the wrong side of the box, which was easy enough. I just popped them out and put them on the right side, thinking that I was going to be able to cover these holes when I installed the legs, but that's not even close. But that's okay, I could fix this.
To start, I need to drill out these holes. And to do that, I'm using a portable drill guide. This is a handy jig that turns your hand drill into a mini drill press. I can set the depth of cut with these stops. Then your drill connects to the top and it's go time. I can just drop the bit to line it up with my screw hole and then make the cut. Then it's rinse and repeat. Oh, and I also need to do the other side because I messed that up too. And the drill guide is not the only nifty tool I'm using. Check out this plug cutter bit, this thing's a beast. To make the plugs, I'm going to use a scrap offcut from the project, and that's going to make it at least halfway match the side of the box. This bit just zips right through it to cut all these plugs. But they aren't free yet, so I need to do that next. The cool social media way to cut these out is with a bandsaw. See, they just hop right out. The much more boring but practical way to do it is just to pop them out with a screwdriver. With a little glue in these holes, I can tap the plugs in, making sure that the grain direction of the plugs matches the side of the box. It's highly unlikely that this is going to be a perfect match, but it's going to be way better than staring at empty screw holes on the side of the planter. Once the glue dries, I can just cut them mostly flush, and then I'm going to get the rest of it with my sander. I'm not worried about sanding the area around the plug too much because I'm going to be adding finish to this anyways to cover up the plug. And I can just rub on a little finish and begin to see how well this worked. Not too bad at all on the color match, but you can tell there's a plug there. Alright, we're in the home stretch now. For the inside of the planters, I'm going to go with a 2-stage liner, which was an idea that I got from Brad at Fix This Build That. First, I'm going to staple black plastic to the inside of the box. I'm just using some cut up laundry bags to do this because I noticed that the plastic was pretty heavy duty. And once that's in, I'm going to use a scratch awl to poke a bunch of holes in the plastic between the slats on the bottom. You could use a screwdriver for this or a sharp stick, whatever you have, but this is going to allow water to drain from the bottom of the box. And then to add a little bit of extra durability, I'm going to add some landscaping fabric. This is going to help hold the soil in the box, but it's also going to allow all that water to pass through it and drain away through the holes in the plastic. And the only thing I have left to do now is to fill these with potting soil and add my favorite plants or vegetables. I think these planter boxes look amazing, and not only do they provide a little extra visual interest to the outside of the porch, but like our chickens, they allow us to be a little more connected to our food sources and enjoy a fun hobby as well.
So 4 years ago, my wife and I got this insane idea in our head that 3 kids, 2 cats, and a dog were not enough living things to take care of. So we decided to double that number and get some chickens, which meant I was on the hook for creating a home for them to live in. Now, questionable judgment aside, this was one of the funnest projects that I've ever done. And 4 years later, our ladies are still doing great.
Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to show you how I built this amazing backyard chicken coop. This thing is awesome. It's got so many great features for being able to easily clean and maintain the coop, as well as gathering eggs in a way that even your young ones can do. The design for this coop was very much inspired by my friend Chris over at Third Coast Craftsman, so a huge shout out to him. My wife and I really love the overall look and thoughtful design that he put into it, and so we wanted to recreate that here in our own backyard. I did design my coop to be a bit smaller than that one because I've only got 6 chickens, and this one will hold 6 to 8 birds comfortably. So let me show you how I built it.
So to get started on this coop, I pretty much have one job, and that's to cut a pile of big 2x4s into a pile of smaller 2x4s. This is going to be a lot of cuts to make, but my miter saw station will make easy work of these 12-footers. Unlike most of my projects, there's no milling of rough lumber. I'm just cutting construction lumber to length and moving on, which is kind of nice for a change. Most everything in this build is standard 2x4s, but there's a few pressure-treated ones in the mix wherever the coop is going to make contact with the ground. And after what seems like hours of chopping, all my parts are cut to length, and now I need to move this stack off my bench so I can actually build something. The first thing I'm going to focus on is framing out the walls and the roof of the coop. The roof is pretty straightforward, everything is 90-degree cuts and just needs to be assembled. I decided to join all these with a framing nailer because it's quicker and cheaper than using screws, but later in the build you'll see that I switched over to using screws. My reasoning for doing it that way is that if I ever want to get rid of this coop, I want to be able to easily disassemble it into its component parts like walls, roofs, etc., but those component parts won't need to be broken down because they're all fairly small, so I could just use nails on those. Assembling the walls of the coop are pretty easy too, but the design has a slanted roof, so I need to cut that angle into the top of all the studs. I asked the internet what's a good angle for a chicken coop roof, and I got everything from about 5 degrees to 18.5 degrees. After designing it out, I went with 15 degrees because it looks pretty good on my coop and the angle is easy to remember. I think if you made a bigger coop than this one, 10 degrees might be a better angle, but for my little coop, I think it looks nice. I am going to be putting a big access door on one side of the coop for cleaning and maintenance, so the studs don't go all the way to the ground, except for the one in front, which I doubled up for added strength. But the angle cuts at the top and the stud spacing are all the same as the other side. The front wall continues with the angles across the top, and I also wanted to add a couple small shed windows, so I framed those in too. The header board does have a 15-degree angle cut on one edge so that it lines up flush with the angled studs, and the bottom is pretty open because that's where the chickens are going to access the nesting boxes. Compared to all the cutting I did, assembling these walls went pretty quick, and pre-assembling these on the bench made it easy to keep everything square. But for the next part of the build, I need to shift over to my garage because the walls of the run are 10 feet long and I just don't have that much open floor space in the shop. The bottom plate of these walls are made from pressure-treated lumber because they're going to be in contact with the ground, and the run will have a slanted roof, but only half the angle of the coop roof because it's much longer. It's about 8 feet tall at the front of the run and slopes down towards the back. I'm 6'2", and I'll be able to stand comfortably at the back of the run without bumping my head, which is really all I ask for in life. For the door to the run, I wanted to add some fancy crisscross bracing with a half-lap joint in the middle. Sounds like something you may not want to do because, well, geometry, but it's actually pretty easy to do and you don't need any math. I can just lay the boards inside the door frame and mark where they intersect. I then just line up my miter saw exactly to that line and set my depth of cut to exactly halfway through the board. Then I can just begin feeding it through the blade like I was back working in the deli department. I sneak up on the final fit and bam! I have an X with no math needed. And it drops right back into the door because that's where I took the original measurements from. Moving on to the base of the coop, I'm going to use 4x4 posts as the main supports, and those get the same 15-degree angle on top. Each 12-foot 4x4 will give me a tall post for the back and a short post for the front. Each front and back post will be connected together by 2 main horizontal supports. To make those, I'm going to gang together a couple of 2x4s. I plan on putting sand in the bottom of the coop a couple inches deep, which is going to be fairly heavy, and I don't want the floor of the coop to sag over time. To attach these to the posts, I opted for pocket screws because I felt like this was going to be the easiest way to get a solid connection to the posts. I put pockets on both the inside and outside for added strength. Now to join the two sides together, it was back to the garage. I decided to attach a couple of temporary feet just to use as helping hands while I attached the other side of the base. This made the process so easy. You can see my reference line there on the side of the post. The height was just right and all I had to do was drive my screws and then remove the temporary support. And then it was time for a surprise inspection by one of the future occupants, just making sure the project is still on schedule. I added 2 more supports in the middle and held those in place with a little scrap of wood, and now all I need is a floor. So I made the base of the coop exactly 4 feet deep by 6 feet long. That way I can use a single sheet of OSB with only a couple of feet cut off one end. The other reason I went with this size is that it's recommended to give each chicken 3 to 5 square feet of coop space to live, and since I have 6 of them, this is going to give each one about 4 square feet each. I marked out notches in all 4 corners and then cut those out just using a jigsaw with a speed square as my guide for a straight cut. This method is so quick and easy that I often use it when I'm cutting out toe kicks on cabinet builds. The floor just drops right into place without too much persuasion and gets screwed down to the frame with 1.5-inch screws, and that's it for the base. The next day I get a few helping hands to carry the base of the coop to the least slopey part of my yard. This was a real challenge for us because I live on the side of a hill, but in the spot that we chose I was able to get it really close by temporarily propping it up with a couple of well-placed 2x4s. Then we could begin adding the walls of the coop. And this is where prefabbing them in the shop was clutch, because all I have to do now is drop them in and screw them into place. On the side where the access door goes, there is no base plate, so I just toe-nailed the front stud to the floor. For the walls of the run, we referenced off the 2x4s at the bottom so that the bottom of the run was flush with the bottom of the coop. And that's a lot of bottoms. This will keep the run and the coop in the same plane so that when we do final leveling, we can get the whole thing at once. We also did the same thing with the back of the run as well. Before adding any more walls, we decided to swap out our 2x4s for some more permanent support in the form of concrete pavers, which you can kind of see in this super out of focus shot. Then we could add the final 2 walls to tie everything together, making the structure nice and rigid. The last little bit of framing left to be done is adding the nesting box, and I left the last 12 inches of the coop just for this. The ideal size for each nesting space is 12 to 14 inches wide, which gives me room for 4 good-sized spaces in here, which should be plenty for 6 birds. I'm told the birds are going to end up picking just a couple of spaces as their favorite and always use those. Hey, this thing is really starting to look like a coop. For the outside of the coop, I'm using T111 siding panels. T111 is a kind of pine plywood that looks like shiplap on one side of it. It comes in standard 4x8 sheets and is half an inch thick. So I can just cut all my panels to size using my track saw in the shop, which is super handy, and then screw them right to the framework of the coop. The panels aren't very big, but to help out, I screwed a scrap of 2x4 to the base of the coop to act like a ledge to hold the panels in place while I attach them. The coop was already pretty sturdy, but now with all these panels screwed to it, it's rock solid. I was able to get the coop covered up pretty easily, and yes, I did cover over my window frames, which will be easier to cut out later than to cut around now. This T111 is going to give the coop a real rustic feel and look great when it's painted. That's foreshadowing. Oh, and randomly I noticed that I hadn't added any sides to the nesting box, so I went ahead and screwed some of the OSB to the vertical supports to wall each space off. To make the siding match the angles of the walls, I opted to cut them with a flush trim bit on my router. This was so quick and easy, but man was it messy. I feel like I was in a blizzard of sawdust. Then I painted the coop, which I decided not to bore you with. But if anyone's curious, I used Emerald Exterior House Paint from Sherwin-Williams. They're not a sponsor, I just use their products all the time. Then it was time to knock out these windows. This is super easy to do. From the inside of the coop, I drilled out 4 pilot holes at each corner of the window framing. This gives me entry and exit points, and I can connect the dots with a straight edge. Then I just drop in my jigsaw and cut to the lines. Easy peasy. Note to self though, staring this close at a fresh white surface in direct sunlight is killer on the eyes, almost like snow blindness. So maybe the next time I cut out windows, I do it before I paint. The windows fit nicely in the openings and screwed right to the framing. You know, they say that the eyes are the windows of the soul. But I also think the windows are the eyes of the chicken coop. Also, the front of this coop looks exactly like a cartoon character that I know, and it's killing me that I can't remember where from. If you know who I'm talking about, please drop it down in the comments below. Help a brother out. Okay, I need to make another hole in the back for the chicken door. I'm using an automagic door that opens and closes based on light levels or whatever schedule I set because, you know, everything these days needs a smartphone app. The one I purchased is made by Run Chicken, and I chose it because it looks really simple to install and operate. To cut the hole, I used the same technique as the windows, but because I did it from the outside, I screwed up the hole locations and hit the 2x4 at the bottom. Whoops! Easy enough to fix, and the door just screws to the wall like this. And now I can test it out. This app will allow you to set the door to open or close based on set hours, or at sunrise or sunset based on your location, or based on the light sensors on the door, which will open 20 minutes after sunrise is detected and close 20 minutes after dusk. I love technology. The next thing to do here is to add some trim to tidy everything up. I'm just using 1x4 and 1x3 pine boards here, and these are tacked on with a trim nailer. These were all primed and painted with the same exterior house paint ahead of the installation, but I did go back and touch up any bare spots on the exposed ends or caused by nail holes. I also added the door to the nesting box, which is just made out of T111 framed with 1x3 boards. I like this door because it swings down for easy access and cleanup, and it stays closed using eye hooks on each side. The side access door was made the exact same way, but I'll add barrel locks later to the top and bottom to keep it secure. Then I added the final bit of trim around the windows to finish off the look. Then I added one of the smartest features to the inside of the coop. Chris over at Third Coast Craftsman built an angled roost in his coop and also a droppings board to go underneath the roosts. This makes it super easy to clean the coop because it opens up the area right in front of the access door, and I can scrape any droppings from the droppings board into a 5-gallon bucket to be used later as fertilizer. And as you can see, a person can still fit inside the coop if need be for deeper cleaning or repairs. I'm also making a 2-level roost over the droppings board, which is going to give my birds plenty of space and also get them plenty of air circulation from the windows. For the roof of the coop, I decided to go with metal instead of shingles. Compared to shingles, a metal roof is much lighter and stronger and also quicker to install because you don't need plywood underlayment, you can just screw it straight to the frame. And because it's so light, it's easy for 2 people to lift into place. Before I installed the roof over the run, I went ahead and covered everything in hardware cloth, which is much easier to deal with now. Actually, if I build another coop, I would go ahead and install the hardware cloth as I assemble the wall while everything is flat on the ground. If you've never used hardware cloth, it's like a stronger version of chicken wire. It comes in big rolls and it's a bear to deal with by yourself, but it's more secure than chicken wire, which is the most important reason to use it. I started out snipping this stuff to length by hand, but that got old really fast. Then I got smart and switched over to a rotary tool with a metal cutting wheel, and that's much better. After that, I installed the door to the run, which I attached with gate hinge hardware and a spring-loaded latch to make sure that the gate remains securely closed. Then we can slide the roof onto the run, which again is so much easier to do with metal roofing. And after attaching the roof with screws, that's it. The coop is complete. All it needs now is some new occupants.
I do have a little work left to do to make this coop as safe as possible and also to beautify it. One thing I'm going to do is extend the hardware cloth out about a foot around the perimeter of the coop, and that's just to help discourage animals from digging underneath. And on top of that, I'm going to add some large landscaping rocks as well as some small shrubs that can really root down and discourage animals from digging underneath also. And I'm going to go back and add some hardware cloth to the windows just so that we can open those up, let the chickens have some ventilation, and not have to worry about predators climbing in through there.
So another great thing to add to your outdoor space is some outdoor furniture. That's going to give you a place to gather and relax. And so here's 3 furniture projects that I've made for our backyard.
I begin by breaking down all my materials to rough length at the miter saw. This project uses 2x4, 2x6, and 4x4 Western red cedar lumber. Western red cedar is an excellent wood species for outdoor use because of its rot resistance and stability. It's also pretty lightweight, which makes moving the table around easier. Next, I run everything across the joiner to flatten one face and then square up one edge. This is going to make it easier to rip everything to width at the table saw. Then I run all my parts through the planer to get the other side of the board parallel with the first side that I flattened. I do the same thing for the leg parts, running one side through and then flipping them 90 degrees in order to make all 4 sides equal and square. Then I mark a diamond on the end grain to note the orientation that I want the legs to be in when I make the table. This will help me make sure to cut the joinery in the right spots. And just like that, I have all the parts to make my table. Now to make the tabletop, I first need to rip my boards to width at the table saw. The reason I wanted to joint the edges of these boards first was so that I could reference that surface against my fence to make sure that I get a perfectly parallel cut. Once that's done, I lay all 5 boards side by side and switch them around until I'm happy with the look. I then make a carpenter's triangle so I can keep track of the orientation of the boards. Now comes one of my favorite tricks for a seamless tabletop. I fold each pair of boards like a book at the glue joint. Then run the first pair on edge across the joiner together. This will make the joint line between the 2 boards perfectly match to one another even if the fence on the joiner isn't square. Now I unfold those boards and fold up the next 2 boards in sequence. And again run those across the joiner together and repeat this process over and over until I've jointed the last pair. Now as I unfold everything, you can see that I have perfect seamless joints to glue up. Speaking of glue up, that's what I'm going to do next, making sure everything is carefully aligned. Now you can use biscuits or even dominoes to help with alignment if you want, but I didn't do that because this tabletop is not very big, so I just was careful with the glue up. And once the top is dry, I sand it with 80 grit sandpaper to remove the glue stains and make everything nice and even. I then switch to 120 grit and finally 150 grit, which is where I'm going to stop. Since I'll be putting a thick exterior film finish on this table, there's really no need to sand past that point because the finish is going to prevent you from feeling the difference. And once I'm done sanding, I trim the ends of the table flush using my track saw. Now from here, I'm going to set the tabletop aside for a while and focus on cutting the joinery for the base. I'm using dominoes to join everything together, but you can easily use 1/2-inch dowels instead, and it wouldn't change anything about this project. But I do have a domino, so that's what I'm going to be using. After laying out the locations of all my joints, I make the cuts for my dominoes on the legs and apron parts. This is a pretty fast process, and all 4 legs are done in no time. Now to begin assembly, I'm careful to orient my legs correctly. I then apply glue to each mortise. Now I'm using Titebond 3 for this build because of its higher water resistance since this is going to live outdoors. And with a mallet, I tap in each of the 8 dominoes. I don't know why, but tapping in dominoes is so satisfying. Then I go ahead and give each domino a little hat made of glue and spread it all over the whole domino. And now I pop on the short apron and stretcher. What I'm doing here is assembling the sides of the table first. A few taps with the mallet will get everything seated well enough. The clamps are going to take care of the rest. Finally, I added the opposite leg and tap it into place. I then put both table sides in the clamps and make sure all my joints are tight. Now after the sides are dry and out of the clamps, I add the remaining dominoes and glue. I then add both long apron parts as well as the long stretcher. These slipped on pretty easily and everything is flush. Next, I repeated the process for the other side of the table. I add glue to the mortises, tap in the dominoes, and then make sure everything is fully seated and covered in glue. Now, who knows why I decided to do it this way, but I did pick up the larger side with the stretchers already connected to it when I could have just picked up the other side of the table and it would have been much easier to connect them together. I guess the cedar is just light enough that I didn't really notice what I was doing. Either way, I got the job done. I then added a clamp to each side as well as to the stretcher to draw everything together. The final step is to add these cleats to the frame with glue. Each cleat has 2 screw holes that I'll use to hold the top to the base and allow it to expand and contract with the seasons. Okay, back to the top. I'm going to add breadboard ends to this table to keep everything nice and flat. I'm using dominoes again instead of traditional tenons for this job. I'll add glue to the mortises on the tabletop side and only glue the center mortise on the breadboard side. Then I pop my dominoes into the mortises on the tabletop side, giving them a little tap to seat them. And then again, only add glue to the center tenon. You should notice the mortises on either side of the center are elongated on the breadboard end. This will allow for expansion and contraction of the tabletop. Now I just made up the breadboard end with the tenons and tap everything into place. I'm using a shop towel here to keep from marring the soft cedar. And once I'm close, I head to get my clamps. I'm using a scrap piece of ash as a caul here to evenly spread the clamping pressure so that I only need to use 2 clamps. And now I'm going to add dowels to each of the dominoes except for the one in the center, which you remember I glued. This will hold the breadboards in place while allowing for wood movement. Now I probably should have elongated the holes in the dominoes to allow for greater freedom of movement. But this cedar is so soft and I elongated the mortises enough that the tenons have room to flex when the wood moves. Just a little trim of the dowels with my flush trim saw and the rest can be sanded flush. Here's that process again. I drill a clean hole until I hit my depth and tap in the dowels. I add glue just to the tip of the dowels before I drive it the rest of the way in, and then cut them flush with a saw. Once the top is dry and out of the clamps, I trim the oversized breadboards flush with my track saw. And as a final touch, I break the edges with a block plane. I really don't want any sharp edges on the tabletop. Now, red cedar does tend to have knots and checks, so I need to fill these using a black CA glue. I just apply the glue to the voids and let it sink in. This is a medium thick CA glue, so it does a good job of filling smaller voids. A couple shots with an activator spray will speed up the hardening time. You can see it doesn't take much to fill these small defects. And once the glue is fully hardened, I can hit it with my sander and remove the excess back down to bare wood. And you can see here how all the little cracks and voids are nicely filled in with the glue. All that was left to do was screw the top to the base using the cleats, and it's done. I finished this piece with a clear epoxy sealer and then topped it off with spar varnish to really bring out the color of the cedar. Hey guys, I'm Matt from MWA Woodworks, and in this video I'll show you step by step how I made this outdoor bench seating from red cedar. Now let's get started. For this project I'm starting with 6x6 red cedar beams. Normally these would be used for building outdoor structures, but these will work perfectly for some stout benches. Now these are rough sawn beams, so I need to start by milling them up square first. To start, I take a couple passes across the joiner to flatten one face. I then flip the beam so that the newly flattened side is facing the fence, and then I run the beam across the joiner again. Doing this is going to make sure that I have two flat faces that are square to one another. This is going to be important later when I go to glue them up. Milling these beams up was the most time-consuming part of this project prior to applying the finish. And next I head over to the planer to get the other two faces of the beams flat and square as well. I just put the sides that I jointed face down on the planer, and the opposing faces are made parallel to it. After a few passes, I have all four sides of each beam flat and squared up. I also need to cut the legs for the bench out of these beams as well, and this is a good task for the bandsaw. The bandsaw cuts like butter through this cedar, and that's nice because there's no blade deflection at all. My cuts were super straight and pretty clean as far as blade marks go. Now once I resaw one side, I flip it and cut the other side to produce the rough leg. And finally, I send each leg through the planer again to clean up any of the mill marks and get them down to final dimensions. Now before I cut the joinery, I need to trim everything to final length at the miter saw. Even for my 12-inch slider, these beams were a bit too much, and so I finished off the cut with a handsaw. To assemble the bench, I'm going to use epoxy. Since these are going outdoors, epoxy is a great choice for an adhesive because it's very water resistant and strong. I'd like to thank Total Boat for helping me with this project and being the sponsor of this video. To use this epoxy, I just need to combine the resin with the hardener in a 2-to-1 ratio and mix it thoroughly. Once combined, I apply an even coat to the glue joints. The seat of the bench is going to be made from 3 of these beams, so I have just 2 glue joints. This cuts down on assembly time and also the amount of resin needed. Clamping pressure is applied evenly across the length of the glue up, and I wipe down any excess epoxy. Now comes the fun part. I've got to wrangle this thing through my planer to clean up the surfaces and get everything flat again. Since I already flattened everything before, this doesn't take very many passes at all. This is also why I wiped down the glue joint earlier. Less interference from dried epoxy means the piece lays flatter going through the planer. And the next step here is squaring up the edges again at the joiner. Since my legs are going to be built into the sides, they won't be square to the top if the sides aren't square to the top, and I'm going to end up with a wobbly bench. Now these ends need to be trimmed up as well, but they're too thick to get through in one pass, so what I ended up doing was running my track saw down one side at full depth. I then flipped it over and transferred my cut line to the other side using a square. I could then use a track saw again to cut the other side, but notice I'm still not all the way through. But no worries, because I can use a hand saw to finish off the part that the track saw couldn't reach. The next step is cutting the joinery in the legs, and I begin by laying out where the notches will be cut in the bench top using a marking knife. To get a tight fit, I use one of my legs as a guide to lay out the other side of the notch. Now to hog out these notches, I'm using my table saw with a dado stack. And a quick note, before I began this process, I waxed down the surface of the saw to make sure everything was nice and slidey. Now what I found the safest approach here to be is to make one pass, then turn off the saw before moving the workpiece back to the other side of the blade and making the next cut. And just like that, I have a clean notch and it's a good fit with the leg. I just repeated that process to create the 4 notches in the sides of the bench. Man, that is such a satisfying process, being able to clear away that much material so quickly. I was a little worried this workpiece would be too big to do this operation, but it actually went pretty smooth. And now that I have the notches in the bench, I need to create the mating notches in the legs. The goal here is for the legs to recess into the sides of the bench and sit flush with the sides. To make this cut, I use a table saw to establish the top and bottom of the notch in 2 passes. Now I could finish this cut off with a handsaw as well, but the bandsaw does a nice job too. Even though I plan on using epoxy on these legs, I thought it might be a good idea to reinforce them with screws. At the very least, the screws can act as clamps while the epoxy cures, so I don't need to fool around with those. Once I have my pilot holes cut, I add plenty of epoxy to the joints. It's a good idea to make sure to apply enough epoxy to the end grain, as it really soaks this stuff up at first. I want to make sure I get a solid connection here and that I don't starve the joint of epoxy. And you can see the leg just slides in nicely thanks to the epoxy being pretty slippery. Then I just added a couple of 3-inch screws to the legs and it tightens everything up nicely. Now on this leg, even the epoxy wasn't helping it slide in easily, so I needed to apply a little persuasion. I just made sure to use a rubber dead blow mallet here because this cedar is pretty soft and I didn't want to dent the face of the leg. It's also a good idea just to double check everything for square before moving on. To cover up the screw holes, I wanted to make some plugs, and man, this is such a satisfying process. This plug cutting bit on the drill press cuts this cedar so effortlessly, and I really love how the plugs just pop right out with a screwdriver nice and clean. I just applied a copious amount of epoxy and plugged the holes. Once dried, a flush trim saw takes care of the excess material and the rest can be sanded flush later. And by later, I mean right now. The first bit of sanding I did here was with an aggressive 60 grit disc. I did this to clean up any of the mill marks and also sand away the glue stains at the joints. This Rotex sander is like a magic eraser on cedar. And after I had the rough sanding done, I went over the whole bench with a finish sander up to 150 grit. Now this bench is going to live outdoors, and so I'm going to be applying a heavy film finish to this, and so it doesn't really make much sense to sand higher than 150 because you're only going to be feeling the finish in the end, not the wood. Now I went back and broke the edges with a hand plane where I could and used my sander in hard to reach places. I also remembered to chamfer the bottom of the feet to prevent chip out. And just for kicks, I broke out the hand plane on the other side of the bench to even up some spots where the legs weren't quite flush before repeating sanding on that side. Now for the finishing process on this bench, I'm going to start by applying Total Boat's epoxy sealer. This stuff is very thin and almost like water, and I'm applying it with a roller. This cedar just drank this stuff up, which is perfect because it's going to help deepen the protection inside the wood for down the road. And if it looked like the wood drank up all the sealer, I went back over those spots with some more. Now once the sealer was cured, I sanded everything with 320 grit sandpaper just to knock down any dust nibs. Now you can tell when this stuff is ready because it's going to produce a fine dust when sanding and it's not going to be gummy at all. A quick wipe down with a tack cloth to remove the majority of the sanding dust, and it's time to apply the varnish. I'm using Total Boat's Gleam 2 Marine Varnish as a top coat here. I'm going to be applying this with a foam brush, but a nice oil-based bristle brush would also be good to use here too. I applied 3 coats of the high gloss before adding 2 coats of flat to knock down the sheen to my liking. And wow, I really love how these things turned out. The color of that cedar just really pops. Hey guys, in this video I'm going to walk you step by step through how I built this bar height table with storage. Now let's get started. For this project, I'm using Western Red Cedar, and I begin by cutting all my parts to rough length at the miter saw. Red cedar is great for making outdoor furniture because it's a very stable wood and it's also rot resistant. So I bought rough sawn cedar for this project, and the 4x4 posts that I bought were true 4" by 4" posts. So I wanted to plane those down to 3¼ inches to look less chunky, and a few trips through the planer made quick work of it. Now with all my leg parts planed down nice and square, I head to the table saw. I need to cut all the rounded corners off my 2x4 parts, and the table saw does this perfectly. I then need to cut all my small parts to final length using my crosscut sled. If you need a crosscut sled for your shop, I have a link to my full build video and also plans in the description below. I cut the longer parts to length by ganging them together at the miter saw to ensure that they were all the same length. I then adjusted the stop to make the cuts for the legs lickety-quick. And I needed to cut all my 3/4 inch material to rough length. These will be used to make the panels for the sides, back, and the door, and also make the shelves. So I was short of 2x4 material to make all my parts, but I did have some extra 4x4, so I went to the bandsaw and resawed it to get what I needed, and this cedar cuts like butter. Problem solved. A quick trip to the planer to clean up all the 2x4 parts, and they are good to go. Finally, I needed to rip the 3/4 material to width at the table saw. And then again, I went back to the planer to bring these down to 5/8 inch thickness, which would work for my side panels and the shelves. The parts for the shelves are then glued up carefully. Since these are no longer going to fit in my planer, I don't want any sloppy glue ups to fix manually. And that takes care of all the milling. I have all my parts cut and ready for joinery. Now making the side panels and door using frame and panel construction, and the first step is to cut all the grooves to accept the panels. I installed my dado stack in the table saw for this task and cut the grooves right down the center of my frame parts. I then cut all the tongues using my tenon jig that rides on my table saw fence. And because I still have my dado stack set up, I can cut these in just a couple passes. If you're interested in making a fence like mine, I'll put a link in the description to the build video and plans for both the fence and the tenon jig. The last step here is to cut rabbets along all 4 sides of the panels to fit inside the grooves. Now to assemble this table, I'm going with epoxy over wood glue. I'm doing this because epoxy has a longer open time, and also it won't swell the wood fibers because it doesn't contain any water. And these things are really going to help a large assembly go a lot smoother. Assembling the side and back panels is really easy. A little glue in the ends of each groove and on the tongues is all you need. Epoxy is really slippery stuff, and it helps the joints go together surprisingly easy compared to wood glue. I really like frame and panel construction because of how simple it is. You don't need to fool around with any fasteners, and if you cut everything properly, the assembly pretty much squares itself up. 2 clamps is all I need to hold this panel together while it dries. And a quick check shows that everything went together square on the first try. Once the panels are out of the clamps, I give them a quick sanding just to remove the glue squeeze out and flush up all the joint lines. I'll do a final sanding later. So as I was sanding these panels up, it suddenly occurred to me that I had skipped a step. Cedar often has a lot of large and loose knots that really need to be secured with epoxy. And as I was assembling these doors, what I should have done is filled these knots with epoxy, let it dry as the door was drying, and then sand everything at the same time. Not a problem, I can go ahead and address it now. Just apply a little blue tape to the bottom here to catch any of the epoxy that might drip through. Fill these, let it set up, and go ahead and sand it smooth now. Now after mixing up some more epoxy, I poured a liberal amount over the knots to allow it to fill in all the voids. I used my stick to help the process along and to prevent bubbles from causing air gaps. Once epoxy fully cures, it sands down very quickly and it doesn't leave a stain on the wood. You're left with a smooth surface and secured knots. The rest of the assembly will be done with dominoes. If you can't use dominoes, 1/2-inch dowels would work too, just make sure to double them up. All of the apron and stretcher parts receive a mortise in each end. For the side panels, I lay out my mortise locations along each side. I then put 4 mortises down each side of the panels. I repeat that same process for the back panel too, laying out my mortise locations and adding 4 mortises per side. Placing the mortises on the legs was a little tricky, but I made this spacer from a 2x4 to raise the domino to the correct height to make the cuts. This also gave me a good stable surface to work from. I could easily work my way up and down each side of the leg, placing my mortises in the right spots quickly. Now the next step is an important one. I want to dry fit everything together. For a project this large, I really recommend not skipping this step. Knowing that everything fits together ahead of the glue up adds peace of mind to an already stressful process. And dominoes really are great for doing dry fits. They do hold everything together pretty well while you're moving it around and arranging everything correctly. Once I'm happy with the fit of everything, I knock it all down and sand everything smooth. Now I'm going up to 120 grit on this step, saving the finer sanding for after the glue up. Now before I start the glue up, I do want to round over the corners of the legs. These are especially prone to dents and dings, and rounded edges help prevent unwanted damage. I just put a round over bit in the router table to make quick work of it. Okay, now we glue. The first stage is to glue the side panels to the legs, creating a side assembly. Each mortise is going to get a liberal coating of epoxy, and this can take a few minutes because we have a lot of mortises here. This is where the epoxy's long open time is most important. With wood glue, you risk the glue beginning to set up and swelling the mortises, making it harder to insert the dominoes. But with epoxy, everything slides together real well, and once the side assembly is together, a couple of clamps will hold it while it cures. And a third clamp in the middle will make sure everything is tight. And at this point, I can glue up the far side of the table with an apron and a stretcher in between. And this one goes a little bit quicker because there are fewer joints. Once the sides are dry and out of the clamps, I can add the back panel and front apron and stretcher. Then I add the second side, just popping it right onto the dominoes. And this is where the lightweight of cedar is really nice. These assemblies don't weigh that much and are easy to handle. I then clamp everything up and let that sit to cure. The last thing to do is to attach the remaining side to the stretchers. And I'm going to hold this together using my pipe clamps at each joint. Oh, and here's a quick tip. Make sure to raise everything up off the workbench using painter's pyramids or bench cookies or even scraps of wood, because you really don't want to wake up the next day to your table epoxied to the bench. That would be a bad surprise. I then go ahead and give everything a final sanding, just making sure that all the squeeze out is cleaned off and everything is nice and smooth. This went pretty quick because of all the sanding that I had already done, so I was able to make it over all the table in just a few minutes. Then I went ahead and tested out the strength of all these joints by flipping the table over so I could finish out these last few steps. I cut my shelves to final dimension at the table saw. I then needed to add notches to fit around the legs, and the bandsaw is really perfect for this job, especially with this mag switch acting as a positive stop. I just cut to my mark and then added the mag switch at the end, and the rest of the cuts go super fast. I'm using CA glue to temporarily hold all the runners in place before I attach them with screws. The glue isn't there to attach them permanently, I'm just doing this as a convenient hands-free way to install the runners. And with a little persuasion, the shelf pops right into place. Now I'm going to fasten the shelves down with screws just like the runners. That way, if I want to adjust the height of the shelves later, I can easily unscrew everything and move them to the desired height. I then repeat that process for the upper shelf, screwing in the runners on the sides and the back, and then adding the shelf. I then need to add hardware to the door, and I'm going to use Euro hinges to keep everything hidden behind the door for a nice clean look. By the way, this door is frame and panel construction just like the side panels. Okay, the final thing to do is to make the tabletop. I'm using two 1.5-inch thick cedar boards to make the top. Because these are 12-inch boards, I only have one glue joint. So I line up everything carefully and add lots of clamps. Now after sanding the top from 80 grit to 180 grit, I'm going to chamfer the underside at the router table. Again, because of the light weight of the cedar, running it across the router table is a pretty easy task. I then filled the voids and knots on the top, this time with black tinted epoxy. Why not? Even though it's tinted black, it still sands down without staining the wood surrounding the knot. Next, I trimmed one end flush with my track saw. I then flipped the top around to trim the other side and then set it aside to apply the finish. Also, I used a hand plane to chamfer the ends to match the sides, but I forgot to film it. I did this because running the ends across the router table would have been too difficult. Now after applying finish to this piece, I went back and I needed to attach the top to the base, and to do that, I'm going to use Z-clips. Z-clips are easy to install and allow the tabletop to expand and contract when it needs to. I'm going to have a full video on how to use Z-clips to attach a tabletop, so be sure to check that out for more details on how this process works. After cutting the slots in the aprons with a biscuit joiner, I set the base upside down onto the tabletop, making sure to center the base on all four sides. I then used one of the Z-clips to locate where the screw holes need to be, and I marked the location with a center punch. Next, I pre-drilled the holes and fastened the Z-clips in place. I repeated this process all along the apron until the base was secured to the top. I also repeated this process inside the cabinet as well, but it was too dark and cramped in there for me to show you on camera. Now, since this table will be sitting outside and exposed to water, I wanted to keep the bottom of the legs from constantly contacting the ground. To solve for this, I'm installing leveling feet into the legs. First, I used a Forstner bit to create an opening wide enough to fit the feet. I then used a smaller Forstner bit to drill the pilot hole for the threaded insert. And after cleaning the debris from the hole, I screwed the threaded insert into place. Now you can use epoxy to secure these if you want, but I felt like these were secure enough, so I just left them alone. I then just screwed in the leveling feet until they bottomed out on the insert, which left them about 3/8 of an inch proud of the surface. This would guarantee that the bottom of the legs would be fine even if water pooled up around them. Well guys, that is it. I love how this table turned out, and my family is going to get tons of good use out of this thing as we spend more time outside on the patio. The open side of the table is big enough for a couple people to sit at, but as a bonus feature, I made this opening big enough to house my rolling cooler.
Well, that's it. I hope that at least one of these projects inspires you to get out there and create some things for your outdoor space. Thanks for watching. See you next time.